Hey there, hope you're having a wonderful day. In this video, we're going to talk about scope in C++. So scope refers to the area where a function or variable is visible and accessible to other code. So for this video, we're just going to focus on variable scope. And there are three kinds of scope. We have function scope, which is only accessible within the function. Then we have block scope or local scope, which is accessible only within the block or inner blocks. So a block is pretty much an if-else conditional statement or a for loop or a while loop. And notice here I said inner blocks. So basically when you define a variable within any of these blocks, the inner blocks will have access to the variable defined in the outer block. So for instance, let's say you had a for loop and you defined a variable here. And then you have an if conditional statement. This is the inner block, and this inner block can actually access this x variable. Whereas if you define a variable within this if conditional statement, for instance, y, this for loop cannot access this variable y over here. So within block scope, you can only access a variable from the outermost block. And then finally, we have file scope or global scope. And this is basically accessible within the entire file. So all blocks, all functions within your code can access that variable. All right, so these are the three different scopes. And let's go over each one. So for this example, let's say I'm making a game. And for this game, we have a player health. And the player has 500 health points. And we define the player health in this main function. And of course, when we have player health, we want to be able to subtract points from the health. So I'm going to create another function called take damage. And here, let's say I want to subtract 300 points. So player health minus equal 300. And here I'm going to call take damage. Now here you can see we have this red squiggle and it says identifier player health is undefined. So we have an error, and if I save and run the program, you can see we get the error player health was not declared in this scope. So even though we defined player health over here, this variable is only accessible within this main function. So this is function scope. So other functions cannot access this same variable name. Now what I can do is I can create another variable within take damage and give it the same name, and let's give it the value 600. You can see the error goes away, and if I save and run the program, you can see player health is 500. So even though I called take damage, player health does not change its value. So what's happening here is we created another variable that is only accessible within this take damage function. So we have two variables of the same name, but they are each confined within their functions. Now I want to modify this one over here. So I'm going to get rid of this, and let's get rid of this as well. If I want to modify this variable, I would need to pass it into our function call. So I'm going to do that here. And let's modify this function so that it takes in a damage value. So I'm going to pass in 300. So let's actually move this over here. And here I'm just going to put player health minus 300. So in take damage, I'm going to pass in an int player health. And I'm going to pass in a damage value. And then I'll do player health minus equal damage. So let's save and run the program. And you can see after we subtract 300, we still get 500. So what is the issue here? Well, if you remember, what we need to do is pass by reference. So now if I save and run the program, you can see player health minus 300, we get 200. And you might be wondering why I don't just take this line and do the calculation here directly. Well, in many games, player health does not go below 0, so I can add a check here. So if player health is less than 0, then I would just set player health to 0. Okay, so if I do minus 600 here, let's save and run the program. You can see we get minus 600 and we get 0 instead of negative 100. And I can also define another function for recovering the player's health. So let's do void recover int player health. And here I can do player health plus equal health. And of course, I can also set a limit. So maybe we don't want the player health to go over 600. So here I'll do if player health is greater than 600, we'll do player health is equal to 600. All right, so let's call the function for recover. So recover player health, and let's just recover 120. So I'm going to copy and paste this, and here I'm just going to do plus 120. Okay, now if I save and run the program, you can see we get 500, then minus 600, we get 0, then we add 120, and we get 120. And I can also change this to 1200, and if I save and run the program, you can see it caps at 600. All right, so here I'm just going to change this back to 300. Now let's talk about local scope or block scope. So here in this recover function, I've set a limit of 600. Now what happens if I do int player health is equal to 600 over here? So this is actually a variable declaration. So I already have a variable called player health over here. Will we get a conflict if I declare another variable here? So let's find out. Let's save and run the program. And you can see we get player health is equal to 500. Then we subtract 300, we take damage, and we get 200 left. And then we recover 1200 and we get 1400. So basically what we're doing here is we're creating another variable that is local to this if condition block. So when I create a variable here, this one takes precedence over this one over here. So for instance, if I do player health plus 200 over here, then this player health is going to refer to this one over here instead of this one over here. So this is the idea of local scope. And once I exit this if condition block, then this variable will no longer be needed. So this specific variable within the block will be discarded. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And instead of declaring the variable here, we want to do an assignment. So let's stick to this. So essentially over here, we are updating this variable player health. So now if I save and run the program, you can see we get 600. Okay, so that is local scope or block scope. And finally, we have global scope. So notice within these two functions, I am passing in player health. And let's say I create more functions that would modify the player health. For instance, maybe I want to use potions or I take damage over time. Basically, if I create more functions that would modify player health, I would need to add player health as an additional parameter every time. So what I can do is I can define a variable outside of the function blocks, and this would be a global variable. So here I can do int player health and set it to 500. And now I can just get rid of this. And because I have a global variable over here, I don't need to pass in the player health variable that I had in my main function, because now with global variables, this variable can be accessed throughout the file. So I'm going to remove this parameter as well. And then let's do the same over here. Okay, now if I save and run the program, you can see we get player health is 500, we subtract 300, then we get 200, and then we recover 1200, which caps at 600. So by declaring this player health variable as global, we can access this value throughout the file. Now over here, I wrote that we should generally avoid global variables unless we are sharing data. So basically, if you want to avoid repetitive function parameters like we did over here, you can just take out the variable and make it global, or if you have constant values. So an example would be player health. You can see we have a limit of 600. So what I can do here is I can create a global variable and I can call this max player health and set it to 600. And let's mark this as const since we are never going to change the max player health. So here I can just move it over here. Okay. And if I save and run the program, you can see we get the same thing, 500, 200, and 600. And for naming conventions, generally you would put a G in front to signify that the variable is global. So you can do G player health like so, or you can do G underscore player health. Basically, the G indicates that the variable name is global. And for constant globals, you can do C for constant, so C max player health, or C underscore max player health. And sometimes you might even see all capitalized letters with snake case. So snake case is basically separating the words with an underscore. So it could look something like this, max player health. So these are all naming conventions that you can use in C++ for global variables. So I can take this and replace this over here. And with the capitalized snake case naming convention, it would be more apparent that this is a global constant. Yeah, so this is global variables, and basically, just to go back to what I was saying before, generally you want to avoid global variables because when you increase the scope, you're basically increasing the area where a function or variable can be accessed. And when you can access a variable, you can change the value. So basically, if you're increasing the scope of your variable, you are making it easier to change, and by doing so, you might make it easier to create errors. For that reason, generally, you should avoid global variables and try to stick to local variables unless you have a specific reason to use a global variable. Okay, so that is pretty much variable scope in C++. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you give this video a like. If you have any questions, let me know down below in the comments. And if you want to stay up to date for more C++ videos, make sure you subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.